There's a quiet kind of realization that doesn't arrive all at once. Not like a storm or a loud argument, but like a slow dimming of the light in a room you've lived in your whole life. You don't notice it at first. You keep moving around like everything is the same, reaching for things in familiar places, speaking in the same tone, believing in the same ideas. And then one day you pause, maybe while sitting alone with a cup of tea that's gone cold, and you understand something has shifted in a way you can't undo. My name is Harold. I am 79 years old, and I spent most of my life believing that family was the one place where you could lean without fear of falling through. I wasn't careless about it. I worked hard, saved what I could, tried to raise my children to be decent, responsible people. I never imagined I would become the kind of man who needed to depend on anyone, but I also never questioned that if the day came, my family would simply be there. Not reluctantly, not conditionally, just naturally the way I had been there for them. When my wife passed, I was 71. It wasn't sudden, but it still felt like being pushed out of a moving train. One moment, I had someone who knew how I took my coffee, who noticed when I was quiet for too long, who filled the house with a kind of invisible warmth. The next moment, the house was just a structure with walls that echoed when I moved. At first, I told myself I was managing. I kept my routines. I made my breakfast every morning, even if it was just toast and eggs. I walked to the mailbox. I paid my bills on time. I even kept up with the yard, though it took me longer than it used to. I was proud of that, in a quiet way, proud that I hadn't fallen apart. But aging isn't something that announces itself politely. It creeps in through small inconveniences that you dismiss until they start connecting into something larger. My knees began to ache when I stood too long. Then they began to ache even when I didn't. I stopped climbing ladders after I nearly lost my balance changing a light bulb. I started writing things down because I'd walk into a room and forget why I was there. Little things, manageable things, until they weren't. My daughter was the first to notice. She started calling more often, her voice carrying a careful kind of concern she tried to hide behind casual conversation. My son, who lived closer, began dropping by on Sundays. At first it felt good. I told myself they were just being thoughtful, that this was what family did. The first time I asked for help, it was simple. I needed a ride to pick up a prescription. My car was in the shop, and I didn't feel comfortable taking a taxi alone. My son said yes immediately. Of course he did. He'd always been that kind of boy, dependable, steady. We drove there, picked up the medication, and on the way back we talked about his job, his kids, the usual things. It felt normal, easy. But something had shifted even then. I didn't see it right away. I just felt it, like a faint pressure in the air. After that, the requests became more frequent, not because I wanted them to, but because I needed them to. Groceries, doctor visits, fixing a loose railing on the porch. Each time they said yes. Each time I thanked them. Each time I told myself it was temporary. What I didn't understand was that something else was growing alongside my need, something quieter, heavier. Visits started to feel different. My son no longer came by just to sit and talk. There was always a task attached. He'd walk in, ask what needed fixing, do it efficiently, and leave. Conversations became shorter, more functional. My daughter's calls began to include pauses, small hesitations before she agreed to things. Nothing obvious. Nothing you could point to and say, there, that's the moment. But it was there. I began to feel it in the way I prepared before asking for anything. I would rehearse the request in my head, trying to make it sound smaller than it was. Less inconvenient, easier to accept. I started saying things like, only if you have time, or it's not urgent, even when it was. One afternoon, I asked my daughter if she could take me to a follow-up appointment. She sighed, just slightly, before saying yes. She tried to cover it, but I heard it. It stayed with me longer than the appointment itself. That was when I first felt it clearly. Not anger, not rejection, something worse. I felt like I had become something extra, something added onto their already full lives. I tried to adjust. I told myself the solution was to need less, so I did. I skipped asking for rides and tried to manage on my own. I delayed appointments. I made do with what I had in the house instead of asking for groceries. I convinced myself I was regaining control. But that came with its own cost. I began to feel isolated in a way that wasn't just physical. It was as if I had stepped slightly outside of the world where everyone else was still moving normally. Days passed without real conversation. Even when the phone rang, I found myself hesitating before answering, as if I didn't want to admit how much I needed that connection. When that didn't work, I tried something else. I leaned into gratitude. I made sure every favor was met with more appreciation than it probably deserved. I thanked them repeatedly, told them how much it meant to me, tried to make them feel valued for helping. That didn't work either. If anything, it made things more uncomfortable. My daughter once told me gently but firmly that I didn't need to make such a big deal out of everything. She said it with kindness, but I could hear the strain underneath it. My gratitude had become another weight for her to carry, so I tried to give back. That seemed logical. If I could balance things, maybe it wouldn't feel so one-sided. When my son mentioned needing someone to watch his children for a weekend, I volunteered before he even asked. I wasn't prepared for how difficult it would be. They were good kids, but they were young, full of energy in a way I no longer understood how to match. By the second day, I was exhausted in a way that went beyond tiredness. It felt like my body was quietly giving up on me. I forgot small things. I struggled to keep up. At one point, I had to sit down just to catch my breath, hoping they wouldn't notice how long it took me to stand again. When my son picked them up, he thanked me, but there was something else in his expression. Concern, yes, but also doubt, as if he had seen something he hadn't wanted to see. That night, I sat alone and understood something I hadn't been willing to face. I couldn't balance this. I couldn't make it equal again. No matter how I adjusted, the fact remained that I was taking more than I could give. And that changed everything. The realization didn't come with anger toward them. It came with a kind of quiet clarity about the situation itself. They had their lives, full and demanding. I had mine, shrinking in ways I couldn't control. The more I leaned on them, the more those two realities collided. The hardest part wasn't their reactions, it was what it did to how they saw me. I could feel it happening, slowly. I was no longer just their father. I was a set of needs, a list of responsibilities, something to be managed. That understanding settled into me like a weight I couldn't put down. I remember one evening in particular. I had called my son earlier that day about a minor issue with the heater. He said he'd come by if he could. Hours passed. Evening turned into night. I sat in my chair, listening to the quiet hum of the house, realizing I didn't even know if he would come. And in that silence, I understood that this wasn't about love. He loved me. I knew that. This was about capacity, about time, about the limits of what one person can carry, even for someone they care about deeply. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough that I began to think differently. Not about them, about myself, about what it meant to rely on someone and what it cost both sides when that reliance became constant. I began to see that the problem wasn't that they were failing me. It was that I had placed them in a position where they couldn't succeed without losing something themselves. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. I didn't change overnight. People like to think realizations come with clean decisions, that once you understand something, you simply adjust and move forward. That's not how it works when you've lived nearly 8 decades believing one thing, building your life around it, trusting it without question. When that belief starts to crack, you don't replace it. You circle around it, test it, resist it, and sometimes fall right back into it without even realizing. After that evening with the heater, I told myself I would stop depending so much on my children. It sounded simple when I said it quietly to myself, sitting in that same chair where I had waited for my son. But the next morning, the same reality was still there. The groceries still needed to be bought. The appointments still needed to be kept. The small things that had become difficult didn't suddenly become easy again just because I had decided to think differently. So at first, I didn't actually change my actions. I only changed the way I felt while doing them. Every request came with a kind of hesitation that hadn't been there before. I'd pick up the phone, then set it down again. Walk around the house, sit, stand, try to convince myself I could manage without asking. Sometimes I could. Many times I couldn't. One afternoon I needed to get to a follow-up appointment for my knees. The pain had been getting worse, sharp in the mornings, dull and heavy by the evening. I knew I shouldn't delay it. I also knew it meant asking for a ride. I must have stood by the phone for 10 minutes before dialing my daughter's number. She answered on the third ring, already sounding distracted. I could hear something in the background, maybe dishes or voices. When I asked, there was a pause. Not long, but long enough for me to notice. "I can take you," she said, "but it'll have to be later in the day. Is that okay?" I said yes immediately. Of course, I always said yes, but after I hung up, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. I had started measuring time not by what I needed, but by what was easiest for them. My needs were being reshaped to fit around their availability, their schedules, their energy, and the strange thing was, I didn't blame them for it. I blamed myself for needing anything at all. That thought settled deeper than I expected. The appointment itself wasn't important. What stayed with me was the car ride. We didn't talk much, not because we didn't have things to say, but because the conversation felt careful. As if we were both trying not to step into something uncomfortable, she asked how I was feeling. I said I was fine. I asked about her work. She said it was busy. The usual exchanges, but stripped of the ease they once had. At a stoplight, she sighed. Not in frustration exactly, more like exhaustion. She didn't even realize she'd done it. But I felt it the same way you feel a draft in a room even when the windows are closed. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. Not because of the pain in my knees, but because of the pattern I was starting to see clearly. Every interaction had begun to carry something extra, something unspoken but present. I tried again to fix it the only way I knew how. I reduced my requests even further. I told myself I would only ask when it was absolutely necessary. Not convenient, not helpful, necessary. At first, it felt like I was doing the right thing. I stretched out my groceries longer than I should have, ate simpler meals, skipped things that weren't urgent. But the line between not urgent and important is a dangerous one. You convince yourself something can wait long enough, and eventually it becomes a problem that can't. That's how I ended up ignoring my medication refill for nearly a week. I had meant to ask my son to pick it up. Then I thought I'd wait until he was already coming by. Then I thought I didn't want to bother him just for that. By the time I realized how long it had been, I felt lightheaded in a way that made standing still difficult. When my daughter found out, she wasn't just concerned, she was upset. Not loudly, not angrily, but with a kind of tight frustration that cut deeper than raised voices ever could. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. I didn't have a good answer. I gave her the only one I had. I didn't want to be a burden. She shook her head, told me I wasn't a burden. But her tone didn't match the words. It carried something heavier, something closer to exhaustion than reassurance. That was when I realized something uncomfortable. Saying, "You're not a burden," had become a reflex, not a truth anyone fully believed anymore, not even me. So I shifted again. If asking less didn't work and saying less didn't work, then maybe I needed to contribute more. Maybe the imbalance wasn't just about how much I needed, but about how little I could offer in return. The opportunity came not long after my daughter mentioned, almost casually, that she and her husband needed a break, just a couple of days. Without thinking it through, I offered to help. I said I could watch the kids. She hesitated just for a second. Then she agreed. At the time, I felt something close to relief. Finally, I thought I could give something back. I could remind them and myself that I was still capable of being useful. The first evening went well enough. We ordered food, watched a movie. The kids were polite, full of stories I tried to follow. I laughed when they laughed, even when I didn't fully understand what was funny. For a few hours, it almost felt like things used to. But the next day was different. I woke up stiff, more than usual. My body didn't recover the way it once did, and I had underestimated how much energy it would take just to keep up. By mid-morning, I was already tired. By afternoon, I was struggling. They wanted to play outside, to run, to move. I sat more than I should have, watching instead of participating. I told myself that was enough. That being present was enough. But then I started forgetting things. Small things, but important. Whether I had given them what they needed. Whether I had locked the door. Whether I had checked on them recently enough. There was a moment, just a moment, when I couldn't find one of them right away. It didn't last long. He had only stepped around the side of the house, but those few seconds stretched into something much larger inside me. A realization of how quickly things could go wrong, and how little control I actually had. By the time my daughter came to pick them up, I was holding myself together more than I was functioning naturally. She noticed. Of course she did. Parents always notice. "Are you okay?" she asked. I said yes, but she didn't look convinced. After they left, the house felt heavier than it had before they arrived. I sat down slowly, feeling every joint, every muscle, not just physical exhaustion, but something deeper, a kind of emotional weariness that came from trying to prove something I wasn't sure I could prove anymore. That night, I faced a truth I had been avoiding. I couldn't solve this by adjusting my behavior. I couldn't make dependence feel balanced again. I couldn't reshape it into something comfortable because the issue wasn't in the details. It was in the structure itself. Every time I needed something, I was asking them to give up a piece of their time, their energy, their attention. Small pieces maybe, but they added up. And over time, those pieces became weight. I started seeing it everywhere after that. In the way conversations ended a little sooner than they used to. In the way plans were made with careful consideration of my needs, as if I were a variable to manage rather than a person to include naturally. In the way, I began to feel like I had to justify even the smallest request. It wasn't resentment in the way people imagine it. It was something quieter, more practical, more human. They loved me. I never doubted that. But love didn't erase the strain. It didn't create more hours in their day. It didn't make my needs disappear. And the more I depended on them, the more those two truths pushed against each other. One evening, I sat by the window as the light faded, watching the street the way I often did. People passed by, living their lives in ways that felt both familiar and distant. And I understood something that settled into me with a kind of finality. I had been trying to preserve something that couldn't exist in the same form anymore, not because anyone had failed, not because love had changed, but because the conditions had. I wasn't the man I used to be. They weren't the children they used to be. And the relationship we had relied on for so long couldn't carry the weight I was placing on it without bending into something else entirely. That realization didn't come with immediate answers. It didn't tell me what to do next. But it made one thing clear. If I kept going the way I had been, I wouldn't just lose my independence. I would lose them in a way that mattered even more. The strange thing about reaching the end of a long-held belief is that there isn't a dramatic moment where everything changes. There's no clear line you step across. It's more like waking up one morning and realizing that something you once trusted without question no longer feels solid beneath your feet. You don't panic. You don't even move right away. You just sit there, aware that if you keep standing in the same place, eventually you'll fall. After everything that happened, I stopped trying to fix the situation by adjusting small things. I stopped telling myself I could manage it better if I just asked differently, or less often, or more politely. I had already tried all of that. None of it changed the truth underneath. So instead, I did something that felt, at first, like giving up. I stopped expecting my children to carry my daily life. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of a quiet understanding that if I didn't change where my support came from, I would slowly lose something far more important than convenient. The first step was uncomfortable in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't about logistics, it was about identity. For so long, I had seen myself in relation to my family as a father, as someone they could count on, and later as someone who could count on them. Letting go of that second part felt like stepping into empty space, but I started small. There was a service in town that provided transportation for older folks. I had heard about it before and dismissed it without much thought. It had always seemed like something meant for people who had no one else. Admitting I needed it felt like admitting something about myself I wasn't ready to face. Still, I called. The man who answered spoke to me like it was the most normal thing in the world. No hesitation, no judgment. He asked for my address, my appointment times, explained how it worked. When he came to pick me up the first time, he greeted me by name, held the door, asked how my morning had been. Simple things, ordinary things. But there was no weight behind them. No sense that I was taking something from him. I paid him for the ride, and somehow that made a difference I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't a favor, it was an exchange. Clean, clear, balanced. That feeling stayed with me. Then there was my neighbor, Daniel, a young man probably in his early 30s who lived 2 houses down. We had spoken before in passing, nothing more than polite greetings. One afternoon, he saw me struggling with a loose fence panel. Without making a fuss, he came over, helped me fix it, and stayed a few minutes after, talking about nothing in particular. Before he left, he said, "If you ever need a hand with something, just let me know." For the first time in a long while, I didn't immediately dismiss the offer. A few days later, I asked if he could help me move a heavy chair. He did. It took 10 minutes. I offered to pay him. He hesitated, then accepted when I insisted. That mattered too. Not because of the money itself, but because it placed us on even ground. I wasn't asking him to carry me out of obligation. I was respecting his time, and in return, he respected my independence. Little by little, I built something I hadn't known I needed, a system, not a grand one, not complicated, just enough pieces in place that my life no longer rested entirely on the shoulders of my children. A driver for appointments, a neighbor for small repairs, a grocery delivery service that I learned to use even though it confused me at first. Each piece took a bit of effort, a bit of adjustment, but with each one I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Stability. And with that stability came something else I hadn't expected. Space. Space between my needs and my relationship with my children. At first, the change was subtle. I noticed it in the way my son called one evening, not because I had asked for anything, but just to talk. We spoke for nearly half an hour about his work, his kids, a game he had watched. There was no task attached to the conversation, no underlying purpose. It was simply connection. I realized halfway through the call that this hadn't happened in a long time. My daughter began visiting more often too, but differently. She no longer walked in scanning the house for things that needed fixing or checking if I had what I needed. She sat, we talked. Sometimes we didn't talk much at all, just shared the same space without that quiet pressure hanging in the air. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch, she looked at me and said, "You seem lighter." It was an odd word, but it was the right one. "I feel lighter," I told her. We didn't dig into it. We didn't need to. The difference was there, clear and undeniable, and that's when I understood the final piece of it. Dependence, when it becomes constant, doesn't just take from one side. It reshapes both sides of the relationship. It turns love into responsibility. It turns connection into coordination. It replaces presence with obligation. My children hadn't changed into people who didn't care. They had simply been placed in a position where caring came with a cost they couldn't always carry without strain. And I had been part of that. Not intentionally, not selfishly, but inevitably. By shifting where my support came from, I hadn't removed my needs. I had redistributed them in a way that made them manageable, not just for me, but for everyone involved. The people who help me now chose to do so within clear boundaries. The driver was paid for his time. My neighbor helped when he could, knowing it wasn't an endless expectation. The services I used operated on structure, not emotion. And because of that, the weight that had once rested on my children lifted. What remained between us was something simpler, something closer to what we had always meant to be. Family, not caretakers, not obligations, not a system of support stretched too thin, just people who loved each other. There was a moment not long ago that made everything clear in a way words hadn't fully captured before. My son invited me to dinner. No occasion, no reason, just dinner. I went, sat at the table with him and his family, listened to the noise of conversation, the small chaos of everyday life. At one point, he looked at me and smiled. Not the careful, checking kind of smile I had grown used to, just a normal one, easy, unburdened, and I realized I hadn't seen that expression directed at me in a long time. On the way home, I didn't feel like I had been accommodated. I felt like I had been included.